Be warned, the following contains graphic descriptions and situations not suitable to all audiences. In addition to the usual fare, this program frequently discusses manipulation, violence, death, sex, negative stereotypes, and a surprising amount of regurgitation. Listener discretion is advised. John Murray Spear entered his home and quietly shut the door. It was late, and surely his family had gone to bed for the evening. He thought about joining them. It had been a long day for him as well. He had awoken before dawn in order to drive his carriage several hours away to help someone in need. The return home had felt even longer, but that was okay. It was his ministry, his and Oliver's. It was all part of God's plan. He fixed himself a cup of tea before retiring to his study. Lighting an oil lamp, he sat at his desk and retrieved a fountain pen and a sheet of paper, carefully arranging them on the surface. Then he closed his eyes and bowed his head. Oliver, who shall I help tomorrow? In a few minutes, he picked up the pen and began writing. When finished, he opened his eyes and read the letter. It included a name, and it was signed Oliver. I'm Jennifer Beck, and this is The Haunted Hustle. In the 1780s, Italian scientist Luigi Galvani was experimenting with static electricity. Those bursts of energy you feel when you scuff across the floor, then touch a doorknob or pet the dog. He was reproducing this electrical discharge with the next best thing: frog skin. Plentiful and cheap, it was the perfect scientific substitute, so long as you were willing to put in a little time obtaining your sample. One day, Galvani was skinning a frog when his metal scalpel picked up a charge and transmitted it to the freshly dispatched carcass's exposed sciatic nerve. And it twitched. The discovery led to an entirely different understanding of biology and a revolutionary change in the way we view ourselves as well. Mankind was no longer a divine creature made in God's image and plucked right out of the Garden of Eden. The body was a machine. Recognizing the relationship between electricity and animation, the discovery led to an entirely new field of study: electrophysiology. Or, as Luigi preferred, galvanism. Soon, the greatest learned minds of science and physiology had a new topic to buzz about. Benjamin Franklin published his scientific forays into electricity with his kite and key experiments. Alessandro Volta discovered a way to store this energy and invented the first battery. And Luigi's nephew, Giovanni Aldini, continued his uncle's research by hosting public demonstrations where he would hook up the bodies of animals and convicted criminals to current. #date night. It's rumored that galvanism was among the deep, decadent conversations had between Lord Byron, John Polidori, and Percy and Mary Shelley that summer on Lake Geneva. It's easy to see how the medical breakthrough inspired her legendary novel Frankenstein in 1818, where Dr. Victor Frankenstein, blind with ambition, stitches together a monster and shocks it back to life. Even the circulation of her novel was affected by this technology. In 1834, Vermont native Thomas Davenport built upon Volta's research to invent the first battery-powered electric motor, one that powered a printing press. The story soon headlined major newspapers in every city, and reporters speculated electricity would one day replace engines powered by water and steam. Readers, too, imagined all sorts of other ways the technology could be applied. This extended to theology and an idealistic Unitarian minister who was tired of waiting for the Messiah. John Murray Spear. Spear was born on September 16, 1804 in Boston. By all accounts, and there are many, he was brought up to be compassionate and mindful of his fellow man. Named after the founder of the Universalist faith, he was active in the church from an early age. He may have seen this as an early sign of things to come, but it wasn't that easy. His father died when he was very young, forcing he and his brother Charles to work in factories to support his mother and grandmother. Not exactly a heavenly beginning. The hours of harsh, dangerous labor were grueling, but thanks to the support of their Sunday school teacher, both boys learned to read and write. That formative education gave them a way out of the factory. In time, he was hired as an apprentice shoemaker, providing a stable income. He took the work, got married, and started a family. In a few years, he felt the call to become a minister, but not the call to attend seminary. Education just wasn't his bag. Still, the church readily accepted the new volunteer, and as an established member of the community, his preaching was well received. He remained very popular amongst his congregation. The words just seemed to come to him. And even if they did learn later that he was no more learned than those sitting in the pews, his independence and desire to do his own research was admired. He was ordained in 1830 and assigned to minister the Barnstable congregation. The Universalist Church of America, a forerunner of Unitarianism, is a Christian sect based on the premise that God is not wrathful, all humans are connected to the divine, and all religious faiths are valid since they all more or less say the same thing. It's not to be confused with the Universal Life Church that ordains everyone online, but they do share a lot of the same premise. And I can't help but think they may have gotten into the same business if they'd thought of it first. In his new role, Spear participated in a work-study course under Hosea Ballou, the father of American Universalism. As he furthered his understanding, he became an active proponent of social reform, including women's rights, labor reform, and elimination of the death penalty. He was also a prominent abolitionist. In the 1840s, our boy is credited with organizing the first Universalist anti-slavery convention and helped to oversee the Underground Railroad efforts in Boston. He made other influential friends as well. He was tight with abolitionist and reformer Theodore Parker, a man whose words would inspire Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. And he was also pals with journalist, suffragist, and social reformer William Lloyd Garrison, who at the time was hanging out in New York, where he made the acquaintance of the Fox sisters. In 1845, he and Charles put their message to print by circulating the weekly newspaper, The Prisoner's Friend, in which Spears talked about the struggles and social inequities of the poor and non-white populations. Since it was filled with facts, compassion, and real-life examples, much of its content could be seen today as woke. But it was also groundbreaking and a real testament to just how long these very same problems have been around. It also makes you kind of wonder why more people don't demand their leaders stop banning books and actually do something about it. Spear did, almost 200 years ago. He also continued his prison ministry, traveling over 8,000 miles to distribute over 75,000 books to prisons in a single year. At the same time, he worked to raise public awareness by giving 80 lectures on the subject, after which he would encourage the audience to speak their mind. His goal was to start a conversation, not to preach or impose his opinions. Whether you agreed with him or not, he believed that if a listener took something away from the experience, it was a win for the common good. But just as those same issues are debated and often disregarded today, a free exchange of ideas often led to boos and insults when he was surrounded by the wrong crowd. Did this make him a little impatient for the second coming? Maybe. If it did, would you blame him? One day during the winter of 1844, Spear was speaking at an anti-Catholic event in Portland when he was attacked by some of these dissenters. If not for Oliver Dennett, a heroic friend who intervened and rushed him to the hospital, there's a good chance he might not have survived. The extent of his injuries is unknown, but records show the enraged mob beat him unconscious. So it's safe to conclude that a concussive injury may have occurred, if not traumatic brain injury. The difference between the two has to do with duration and severity. A concussion occurs when the brain encounters minor injury, like a bump or a jolt to the head. Generally considered less damaging, it certainly does not mean they should be brushed aside. Even a minor blow can temporarily affect normal brain function and can result in long-term problems if repeated. Traumatic brain injury is like a concussion on steroids. The blow to the brain is more severe, and consequently, so is the damage. TBIs cause bruising, bleeding, and torn tissue of the brain itself. As a result, they can generate a myriad of temporary and permanent impairments in cognitive, physical, and psychosocial functions. Both are very complex, requiring careful treatment, monitoring, and rest in order to recover. Either way, the experience was transformative. When Spear awoke, he reported witnessing strange visions and omens. His circle didn't think much of it, undoubtedly relieved he had recovered it all. But as his health improved, something about him had changed. He just didn't act right. He behaved differently and no longer showed interest in the things he'd done before. And he wasn't in tune with reality anymore. He focused on other things, other beings. Which brings us to the possibility that our boy was experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, a mental health condition that can develop after experiencing a traumatic event. You know, like being beaten senseless by an angry mob. While its origins cannot be concretely defined, it's generally believed it manifests itself as the mind's way of trying to process what happened, and perhaps to protect itself from the trauma occurring again. Unlike so much about our mental health, its effects are incredibly complex and diverse. Flashbacks and nightmares are common, as are anxiety, avoidance, guilt, and shame. Some report the need to engage in self-destructive behavior, while others experience hyper-awareness. An increase in impulsive behavior is common, and physical symptoms have been reported as well, such as headaches, chronic pain, and tension. It can't be overstated that Spear went through something terrible, or that those effects would stay with him long after his physical injuries had healed. Without access to therapy and support, who knows what he carried with him? And probably for the rest of his life. Dennett died shortly after the attack. Spear must have been crushed to lose his friend at a time when he was so vulnerable. Maybe he even blamed himself for putting him in such a precarious position in the first place. But those feelings subsided when one evening while alone, he picked up a pen in his left hand. Or rather, his left hand picked up a pen. He had no desire for a pen and had not commanded his hand to do it at all. Even stranger was when his hand put pen to paper and began writing. Spear watched in shock as his hand scribbled independently, filling page after page. When it stopped, he read them. It was a letter instructing him to find a man named David who needed his help. The handwriting looked nothing like his, and it was signed Oliver. Spear's condition with his idle hand is uncommon, but it's not completely unique. There's actually a term for it: alien hand syndrome. According to the National Institutes of Health, this peculiar condition can be caused by a variety of things, such as stroke, epilepsy, infections, tumors, aneurysms, and even some brain surgeries. For months, he continued to receive messages from his spectral pen pal, referring him to people in need. It almost seemed like he was in direct communication with God. In no time, he was convinced of as much. It certainly made more sense to him than his life being dramatically altered by mental and physical trauma. And it prompted him to do a complete 180 in his beliefs. Suddenly, he saw a new path to save humanity. He stopped lecturing about abolition and prison reform to take up missions from the dead. He was unstoppable, and word of his good deeds and connection to the spirit world spread. In 1852, he broke all ties with the Universalist Church in favor of a religious movement that better aligned with his calling: spiritualism. Spiritualism was a conglomeration of beliefs, including the idea that the dead can communicate with the living and intercede on their behalf. A diverse and generally accepting bunch, they also believed that God was infinitely intelligent and that the world was an expression of that intelligence. It was very much like the Universalist Church and so many of the other Protestant offshoots, except with a medium instead of a priest, a seance instead of a ceremony, and a parlor instead of a pulpit. In a time when the world was in a constant state of turmoil, with industry and science greatly outpacing the general knowledge and education of the common man, spiritualism offered answers. It gave people a way to make sense of so much personal and societal confusion. By the time Spear took the leap, most people believed communicating with the dead was possible and that almost anyone could do it. Professional mediums were all the rage, and for a reasonable fee, one could attend a seance, sit for a spirit portrait, or a session with a scribe or other diviner. As with many who have suffered from the condition, Spear's symptoms eventually faded, and Oliver stopped writing his buddy letters. But by then it didn't matter. As he had always done before, he promoted himself as an expert, a seer, healer, counselor, and medium, although there's nothing to show his qualifications for any of these, except his own encounters. In spite of this, he circulated business cards, which described his services as, quote, guided and assisted by beneficent spirit intelligences, Mr. S will examine and prescribe for disease of body and mind, will delineate the character of persons when present or by letter, and indicate their future as impressions are given him, will sketch the special capacities of young persons. And he added, applications to lecture or hold conversations on spiritualism will be welcomed. Spear poured every bit of energy into his new calling, soaking up every piece of literature he could. This includes Andrew Jackson Davis's book, The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations, and A Voice to Mankind, a book which Jackson Davis later claimed prophesied the coming of the Fox sisters and the spiritualist movement itself. We covered this in our 2-part premiere, along with a lot of other interesting things about this foundational period of history. If you haven't listened to it yet, take this shameless plug as a hint that you should. If you have listened to it already, listen again. It's amazing how so many of our characters intertwine. Of Jackson Davis's book, which, in case you were wondering, didn't predict the trio's psychic arrival any better than a general hypothetical reference to a generalized description of a vague concept, Spear wrote it was one of the most wonderful works ever made by mortal man. Apparently, he missed the part where the author denied any responsibility for its writing at all. Jackson Davis actually claimed the book was a compilation of communications he'd had with the Swedish philosopher and spiritualism conceiver Emanuel Swedenborg and the Greek physician Galen. The two men practically man-crushed over each other when they finally met. Jackson Davis gushed over the minister's resume and then recommended Spear give himself over even more. He told his new friend, "You will meet them. They will come to you." Spear took the directive as prophecy and did everything he could to speed it along. Soon, besides attending seances, he was conducting his own. He also channeled messages from a wide range of people he admired, various philosophers, historical figures, and his namesake. As proof of these interactions, he produced various documents supposedly signed by them. But the signatures looked nothing like the ones on historical records. probably on account that he signed them himself. In spiritualism, he found a new congregation, an ever-growing group of people receptive to his claims and teachings. As his body of work grew, his followers organized and distinguished themselves. No longer just general garden variety spiritualists, they formed their own branch, the practical spiritualists. They shadowed Spear like Swifties, following him on tour and buying his pamphlets and literature. When he announced his plans to relocate to Chautauqua County, New York, less than a year later, many uprooted their lives to join him. There, they founded a utopian commune based on his many revelations, not the least of which was abstaining from monogamy in favor of free love. Hippie. They were overjoyed when he announced a new project. He was recruited to be the mouthpiece of the Association of Beneficence. Never heard of it? Neither had anyone else. The association was a committee of important VIPs whose mission was to govern America the way the Founding Fathers intended. And, since membership was comprised of the fathers themselves, they knew what they were doing. According to Spear, the Association of Beneficence was a ghostly Illuminati, a committee made up of the likes of John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, among others. If this sounds strange to you, you're not a spiritualist. Claiming a connection to a dead historical figure was practically a celebrity endorsement. Ben, for example, had quite a bustling schedule after the emergence of seances. He appeared to almost every medium who evoked him in every way imaginable. Believers of such an exciting and promising new movement didn't care, and it's not like anyone could conclusively prove them wrong. Ben wasn't talking. According to Spear, Jefferson was particularly vocal and in complete alignment with his spokesman's political views. President number 3 supposedly told him the country was occupied by thieves who had stolen that which was most valuable, human rights, and that leaders who supported slavery were infernal scoundrels who should be shut up in pits of everlasting infamy. Admittedly, those are pretty big words from the one guy whose legacy and bloodline are forever connected to the practice. But Spear didn't know any better. And he didn't have time to learn either. He had revelations to bestow and interviews to give. By year's end, Spear claimed the association broke off into different committees and subcommittees, the complexity of which required a pie chart and several stick figure drawings to understand, each with its own mission and priorities. I haven't been able to determine exactly how many of these groups there were. According to their mouthpiece, the dead presidents and other historically important white guys organized themselves into different think tanks based on their accomplishments and expertise while they were alive. But their labels were rather simple. It kind of broke down like the governmentizers, the educationizers, the agriculturalizers, the healthfulizers, and so on. While he worked for all of these ghostly groups, the one Spear really seemed to have an affinity with was the electricizers. They were the ones who would bring in a new era of enlightenment through technology. The idea probably came out of the spiritualist speculation that electricity was connected somehow to angels and heavenly beings, although Spear didn't give them credit. Putting his own spin on it, Spear's electricizers shared practical advancements like plans for an improved sewing machine and an electric boat, as well as some more outlandish projects more in line with the brand, like an intercontinental communication network powered by telepathy. The electricizers must have been aware of the logistical challenges of their telepathic AT&T, so that plan was followed by instructions that the user should cover themselves in copper and zinc batteries before attempting to connect, in order to boost their signal. While not exactly practical, it probably sounded easier than waiting a couple hundred years for 5G. Of the notions carried with him from his abolitionist days was the idea that technology would bring about social equality, allowing for 4-hour work days and universal wealth for all. He envisioned a perpetual motion machine, a device that could run forever, generating the same amount of energy it consumed. In 1854, the association commanded him to build it. What are the odds? Deemed the new mode of power, Speer decreed the machine would revolutionize spiritualism and the civilized world. The machine would be divine, immaculate, and alive. It would remake the world in God's image, ending slavery, farming, factory work, and housework. People would be free to open themselves up to righteousness and spirits. It would be a Frankensavior. His followers arranged for his announcement to be accompanied by grand public fanfare, but it fell flat. Remember that metallic battery suit to boost mediumship abilities? Researchers tried it in St. Louis. Their kindest feedback was that the device was based on the most preposterous presumption and absurd fanaticism. Some of his detractors wondered aloud what Speer would try to make them wear next. But Speer blasted these authorities, accusing them of atheism and mainstream media of steering the public away from heaven's true intention. Instead, he gave interviews to like-minded reporters and periodicals he could trust. The editor of the Boston New Era, a follower named C.C. Hewitt, ran far more preferential stories, calling it a mechanical miracle and God's last best gift to man. It almost makes you wonder what he could have written if the thing actually existed. With such remarkable claims, readers took notice, and Hewitt increased his coverage. He collaborated with Speer, declaring the all-but-created invention possessed supernatural qualities, capable of imparting energy like blessings. Rather than electricity, a subject Speer thoroughly demonstrated he didn't know a damn thing about, Hewitt told readers the machine was powered by an indwelling spiritual principle, and lambasted scientists and researchers who said Speer's power source didn't exist as being closed-minded and agents of the devil. All one needed to know he spoke the truth was the power of their own belief. Quote, "As a living, working mechanism, the new motor will bear a race of self-replicating, self-powering machines. It will remedy the curse of Adam and humanity's need to earn wages and food by the sweat of his brow." But although Hewitt's stories generated interest from his base, extreme fanatics with a similar homegrown education and disdain for academics, they failed to gain traction with moderates and independents. Even other spiritualists were a bit skeptical. Not that it mattered to Speer. He had a messiah to build. We'll pick up the story next week. This has been The Haunted Hustle. Thanks for listening. The Haunted Hustle is an original production of Toil and Trouble Media. Executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Erin Iris, and our music was by Kevin MacLeod, Light Saturation, and the Schizoid Nightmares. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed our podcast, and I really hope you do, be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast provider and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. And give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Heck, give us a 5-star rating on all of them. We can use all the stars we can get. And help us spread the word. Tell your friends about our show and its totally bingeable content. Tell your spirit guides too. We're not picky. And if you want to help us bring even more Toil and Trouble to the world, check out our merch and our Patreon pages. We have a link at toilandtroublemedia.com, or you can find it on Patreon itself. Just look for a sign. Well, it's the owl, but close enough. And as always, thanks for listening.